Yeah.
And the next one.
Wow.
Plenty of time to get the notes in.
Gosh, wow. Wow. Yeah, 10th of May.
Bloody bank
Nearly
holidays.
halfway through the year, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, it's bank holidays, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, keep getting about bank holidays.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Nice to see you all. Judy and I were just contemplating. The next time we meet, it'll be the 20th of May. Ridiculous. I think we ought to cancel some of these bank holidays. I don't think there's anything else to fill you in on. I shall hand over to Judy and the reign of King Richard. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody. Morning, hope you're all well. Yes, the reign of King Richard II. Just to say, as an introduction, that we've got a way of thinking about history, a bit like 1066 and all that, if you're familiar with the book, which is a sort of satire on the way we learned history. Good kings, bad kings. And we do that now with prime ministers and governments. We tend to mark them out of 10. And the thing that happens is that you're sort of giving them marks and judging them and evaluating them. And it's a little bit like a roller coaster, certainly when we're looking at the medieval kings. Good king, bad king, not so bad, sort of jury's out, nobody quite knows whether they were good or bad, and then evaluating again. So sort of Richard I, wonderful, because he was a crusading king. He did very little for this country except take lots of money and spend it on the crusades. So good, thank you. Good king, John, bad king. Henry III, not very successful, but not an actually bad person, but certainly his reign wasn't very successful. Edward I, wonderful. Edward II, rubbish. Edward III, wonderful. Richard II, rubbish. Henry IV, jury's out, good, bad, not wonderful. Henry V, brilliant. It rather depended on whether the king managed to beat the French at any point. If they managed to beat the French, they came out 9 out of 10, even 10 out of 10, wonderful. If they quarrelled with their aristocrats, with their peers, their lords, they were rubbish. These harsh judgments, I think, were the way we were taught history, basically, and that's why 1066 is such a funny book, because it's sort of mocking this way of evaluating kings and queens. But we still tend to do it with governments. And what we forget is that leaders and kings and queens and emperors and governments inherit situations. And they're then blamed what happened during their period in office. And often they are dealing with an almost impossible situation, and it's not their fault. There are situations beyond their circumstances beyond their control, and inherited problems not of their making. And this is very much the case with Richard II, who comes out badly. Is regarded as one of our not exactly bad kings, but not very successful. Well, the first problem, of course, was that he was a child. And I haven't looked up where it is, although I have got a Bible concordance at home, but I'm too lazy to have looked at it. Every time I think I must go and look this up and I forget. Woe unto thee, O country, when thy king is a child. It's Old Testament. Woe unto thee, O country, when thy king is a child. It has always been a recipe for disaster because it makes the country look vulnerable and open to invasion attack from outside powers. That child can't lead armies into battle, and seeing a child being anointed as king just creates the idea that that country is weak and could be attacked, could be defeated, easily defeated, because their figurehead is a child. And unfortunately, because Edward III's son, the Black Prince, the Prince of Wales, also called Edward, died of dysentery a year before his father. And he had been very popular. He was like his father. He was a warrior. He was successful in battle. He had all the attributes required to be a good king of England, using the judgments of the time. That he was warrior material and successful in everything he'd undertaken. But he died rather slowly and horribly over several years, being weakened by dysentery. And tragically, he died before his father. And the background for poor Richard II wasn't good. He was the child of Edward, Prince of Wales, the Black Prince, and Princess Joan, who's famous in her own right. Her nickname or title, or well, it was a nickname really, the Fair Maid of Kent. She was very, very beautiful, and she'd married young, and the belief was that the Prince of Wales remained a bachelor because he had been in love with her. She'd then married somebody else, and he was sort of waiting for her to become available, which is very unusual in those days. I mean, love didn't normally come into marriage for top people in the Middle Ages. As you know, marriages were arranged for cynical reasons, either as an alliance of some sort, or to gain land, or some kind of an advantage, or to make friends with another country that had been our enemy, which is why we had so many French queen consorts of French origin, because we were always at war with France. So marrying somebody French didn't seem to make any difference to the war situation. But the Black Prince did wait, and waited successfully, because he was then able to marry Joan, the Fair Maid of Kent. She did become available when her husband died, and it was an incredibly happy marriage, because it was a love match, which is very unusual in medieval times. Despite all the romantic poetry and the romantic songs, most marriages for top people were not love matches. They were arranged for, well, almost commercial, you might say, almost commercial reasons. So they had two sons. One died when he was young, Edward, and that left Richard. So Richard succeeded without opposition, but he was only 10 years old. He had been well educated, but he didn't appear to follow in his father's or his grandfather's footsteps. He was not warrior material. That became very clear very early on. He was a delicate looking child. He wasn't delicate in health, but he didn't look particularly like his father or his grandfather. Delicate features, rather feminine features, and feminine in several other ways. That he loved fine fabrics, he loved fine clothes, he was artistic, he collected beautiful objects. That wasn't seen as a very masculine thing to do. That was seen as a feminine sort of activity. He was a connoisseur, a collector of fine arts, and delicate looking, and sensitive in nature. And so they weren't exactly disappointed in him, but they didn't think he was going to be, he wasn't going to follow the family tradition of being a great warrior. And as we were in the middle of the 100 Years' War against France, we sort of required a warrior king. And Richard didn't look as though he was going to shape up in that direction. So who looked after the country? John of Gaunt, his uncle, the Duke of Lancaster. Not officially the regent, but just looking after the country until the little king grew up. So that was the situation when Richard inherited the throne. And the situation on his accession, was that we weren't doing very well in the wars against France. We had been very successful, remembering Crécy and Poitiers, and actually capturing the King of France and holding him to ransom and so forth. You know, we had been incredibly successful. But the end of King Edward's reign, things were very much in decline. We weren't doing very well. The French had actually sacked Rye, Portsmouth, and Plymouth. They'd made an alliance with the Castilians, and you know, they were actually attacking our country. And Calais, Bordeaux, and the Scottish border were at risk. Civil war in the Low Countries was harming our wool trade. Our wool trade was absolutely key to success. Our wool trade was our main export, and very successful too. But civil war in the Low Countries was making it difficult to export, to send our goods once they reached the continent, for them to be sent anywhere else. There were sort of high customs duties and all kinds of problems because of very, very disturbed situation in the Low Countries. Therefore, loss of revenue. Wool exports produced a great deal of money, and the treasury was gradually experiencing difficulties. The king himself, Edward III, went into decline. Nobody seems to quite know why. Probably the way we were taught was, if we were taught about it at all, was that he went into what used to be called early senility, senile decay, they used to call it. Nobody really knows, but he certainly wasn't the man he'd been. And as a result, people were sort of taking advantage of weakness at the very top. Everything seemed to be going wrong. John Wycliffe, for example, that we've looked at, he was sending out his missionary priests with their very radical for those days and radical for nowadays, radical teaching, criticizing the church, accusing the church of being weak and corrupt. Well, corrupt first and not dealing with the corruption, so weak in that they weren't dealing with problems. And he was preaching something very, very radical, the equality of all men and women and the need for social justice. So he was kind of hundreds of years out of his time. Sort of, it was seen as dangerous. It was, if you imagine, like the Americans, very afraid of communism, very afraid of socialist ideas, paranoid about socialist ideas. Well, that was the situation, that John Wycliffe was preaching these ideas of equality, and hundreds of years before that became an acceptable way of thinking. And the other situation, which was very worrying, but because there wasn't any news in those days like we've got today, this would be flagged up. But in those days, of course, there wasn't any kind of news medium, no media. There wasn't what we call media, no newspapers, no television, no radio. The only way of getting any news was traveling peddlers, traveling salesmen would bring news, probably the next village or the next market town, what was going on there, but not international news or what was going on in London or what was going on in what was happening in the government. It took weeks and weeks for news of a king's death to arrive in far-flung places like the Yorkshire Dales. Even centuries later, our ancestors didn't know about very important events until a peddler or somebody that had travelled came back and said, oh, guess what's happened? You know, it happened a few weeks ago, the king's died. It's hard for us to imagine that situation. So it wasn't flagged up that the peasants were becoming very, very restive. People would only know what was going on in their own locality. They wouldn't necessarily know that it was happening all over the country. And what was happening, it was a result of the Black Death, that the feudal system was breaking down, but it was being enforced in many areas, that the peasants were being made to work harder than they'd ever worked in their lives because of shortages of labourers. Feudal restrictions were being enforced on fewer people, and they were understandably becoming very stroppy about it, that they were having to continue to work as serfs. That meant they had to work for nothing on the Lord's land 3 days a week. So they only had Sunday off, so 6 days left. Half of the week, first 3 days of the week, they worked for the Lord for nothing. They worked on his land, or with his animals, or dealing with his timber, whatever it was. They had to work free of charge for nothing. They had to work for the Lord. And then the remaining 3 days of the week, they could work on their own land. And they also had to give gifts at certain times, enforced gifts. So many eggs, so many hens, so much timber, whatever. They had to, they were supposed to be, they were called boon gifts. But they weren't, they're enforced. It was all written down somewhere. The peasants couldn't read, but they knew what they had. They knew what their obligations were, what their duties were. And they were becoming more and more resentful because the duties had been stepped up. They were having to give more. They were having to pay more in taxes. Or if they couldn't pay, if they hadn't got any money, then their duties had been increased. Their gifts, the things they had to give had been stepped up. And sometimes they were having to work extra days. So 4 days on the Lord's land, 2 days for themselves. So understandably, there was great discontent among the peasants, but it came as a shock to the government when actual rebellion broke out. Nowadays, it would be flagged up for weeks and weeks before, and there'd be interviews and people asking other people's opinions and experts being brought in, and it would be predicted and it wouldn't come as a huge surprise. But in those days, as we've explained, there wasn't any way really of sharing news. So the discontent had been going on. So the Peasants' Revolt, which was huge, 1381, absolutely huge. So the discontent had been going on for years, what's called endemic. But people hadn't realised in a joined up kind of way that it was a national situation. And John Ball, a radical priest, was actually advising peasants not to pay the tithe. That was something, tithe means a tenth. And that was enjoined in the Old Testament, that people should give a tenth of their harvest to God. And then that continued when into Christianity, that people should give a tenth. If they hadn't got money, then they should give the tenth of their goods to the church. And this went on until 1836, tithing, giving a tenth of your goods, enjoined in Holy Scripture, taught in the Bible, therefore a commandment. And John Ball was actually saying peasants shouldn't have to pay a tithe. Why should peasants have to pay? And he was teaching something very radical, like Wycliffe, even more radical. All are equal in sin. Well, the church was supposed to teach that anyway, but he was just reminding people that there's an awful lot of hypocrisy about, that it seemed to be the peasants that were the sinners and nobody else. All are equal in sin and all need grace and forgiveness. And then he came up with this amazing sort of mantra or motto or slogan. We call it a slogan today. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman. In other words, when God created the world and God created the first people, he didn't create a class system. It's powerful stuff, managing just in a few words to undermine the feudal system. When Adam delved is the old word for digging. When Adam was digging and Eve was spinning, who was the boss then? Very powerful. Very powerful indeed, and very dangerous. Who made the class system? Surely God didn't. So how come it's being inflicted on people who can ill afford to pay more or work harder? Why is life so unfair? And he's saying, you teach it's God's will, that God ordained this, that God ordained that people should be born into a certain situation and they should put up with it, because to complain about it is to criticize God and the way he has created the world and society. And that was a very powerful put down for anybody that was arguing that they didn't like the way society was organized and they didn't like the feudal system, to just say, well, God has ordained it. You are criticizing God. You are a blasphemer. You're a heretic. You better be careful, otherwise you are going to be in very big trouble. And that normally kept our ancestors quiet. They might grumble among themselves, but they didn't broadcast their grumbles too much because they could get into very serious trouble. Heresy could carry the death penalty. So John Ball is questioning that and saying, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Who created the class system? Human beings, not God. It's still controversial. It's still radical. And then there were poets, Chaucer and William Langland, pointing out the faults in the church and in society and calling it a world out of joint. It's interesting, it's not a modern phrase, out of joint. And Langland wrote, again, made a very controversial statement that the church was a dunghill covered in snow. Wow. A dunghill, something horrible and smelly, covered in snow, which was purity itself. White snow represented purity and godliness. In other words, if it was something horrible and smelly covered in snow, that represented hypocrisy, something horrible, pretending to be something wonderful and good. Now, he wasn't a revolutionary. He just said the times are out of joint. We should go back possibly 2 centuries, certainly 1 century, back to the 13th century, when he said religion was pure and not hypocritical, and it wasn't all commercialized and materialistic as it was becoming in the 14th century following the Black Death. It had become very commercialized and materialistic, with more and more shrines opening, showing false relics and charging a lot of money for pilgrims to go and see the relics. And that was what he was going all about. That was what he was criticizing, the fact that religion had become sort of stereotyped and materialistic and full of faults that nobody seemed to be dealing with. Nobody seemed to be correcting them or reforming them. But the real trigger for what became known as the Peasants' Revolt was the rising expense of the war. The war against France was dragging on, and we weren't having any fantastic victories to cheer everybody up. People didn't seem to mind paying as long as they were getting value for money, which meant if they were having victories and we could lord it over the French and say we're better than they are, people would pay, just as they had paid for Richard I to go into to go and rescue Jerusalem from the Muslims. People paid, possibly not cheerfully, but they paid. They didn't grumble and complain. But now they're saying what is the government actually doing with all this money we keep paying? We're not doing very well in the war at all. How come the cost of living is going up? How come food is more expensive? Because there was inflation. I mean, nobody understood what to do about it, but there was inflation. And so people are saying we're not getting value for money. What's happening to this all this money we're paying? And we're not doing very well against France. And that was making them discontented. Not just the extra work they were having to do, but the feeling that times are out of joint. Things were going badly. A bit like now. And these criticisms were mounting up, but the real trigger was the cost of living and the fact that the wool trade was doing badly. That had been the godsend, really, the fact that our wool trade was so successful. We were exporting wool all over the known world. But now it had become difficult because we're an island, and we had to sort of export, first of all, on to the continent and then distribute from there. And that wasn't working out very well because of war, because of disruption on the continent. Our wool trade was being really rather dramatically affected. But the real trigger is always a sort of final, last straw that breaks the camel's back with any situation. There's a final thing that happens, a final event that creates the drama, the final trigger. And this was the poll tax. Poll meaning head, the old name for a head, poll or poll. The first two poll taxes that the government introduced, very sensibly, were called graduated, like income tax today. Graduated according to the ability of the person to pay, or the village, or the area. The first time, the peasants only had to pay old 4D, old money, 4D, 4 pence. But the third one, so there were two graduated poll taxes, and then the third one that the government introduced was a flat rate. Everybody had to pay a shilling. It wasn't graduated. And as a result, people just didn't pay. Tax evasion on a massive scale. And the government, who has to be said, Edward III's government had created some very efficient rules and regulations regarding the collection of taxes and finding out who hadn't paid and organising some kind of punishment for those people or getting the money out of them somehow. They got a very efficient tax system. So the government sent out local investigators to find out who these naughty people were who hadn't paid their taxes and dues to the government when required to do. In other words, it was a sort of treason. They were refusing to obey government instruction. It wasn't just tax evasion, therefore. It could be interpreted as treason, offence against the monarch. And they actually went from house to house. So it was very, very thorough and caused massive resentment, as you can imagine. Massive resentment. And 2nd of June 1381, anger had risen to the point where 6 government officials were murdered by a mob at Brentwood in Essex. So that's seen as the outbreak of what became known as the Peasants' Revolt. And there were simultaneous attacks on officials in Canterbury in Kent. John Ball, who'd been imprisoned for his radical ideas, was then released from prison by a mob and was hailed as a leader and a folk hero, representing the downtrodden and the dispossessed. And he sent out, again, very interesting, modern sort of messages. Stand together. Brilliant. If we stand together, we will succeed. That didn't work out, but it's good advice. Stand together. He hath rungen your bell. That sounds a bit weird to us. He, meaning God or Jesus, has rung your bell. Means this. God has alerted you to you're talking to the rich, the lords of the manor, and the aristocracy, the rich people, the bosses. This is a warning. That's what he meant. He rung your bell. This is a warning to you. You're out of order. You're pushing us too far. You're pushing us too hard. We've had enough. This is a warning. He rung the bell, warning. Make a good end of what hath been begun. In other words, keep going. We've started something here. Don't give in. Keep going. Again, good advice. Don't be afraid. Whatever threats they make against you, keep going. In other words, he was saying, we could win. Now, the problem with peasants' revolts, as I'm sure we all know, they've happened all over the world over many centuries, and they very, very rarely succeed. Very, very rarely succeed, unless they have middle-class support, as they did in the Russian Revolution. It wasn't just the peasants or the poor people. It wasn't just poor farmers and people who were poverty-stricken. They had middle-class support. And the French Revolution, similarly, it wasn't just starving peasants. They had middle-class support. If they don't have middle-class support, then peasants' revolts usually fail, because they haven't got weapons, they're not used to organisation, they sometimes lack, I would say intelligent leadership. They probably have got intelligent leaders, but they haven't got leaders with experience of leadership, and they're usually not very good at strategies, working things out and thinking of consequences. The odds are stacked against them, really. Again, all they've got is numbers. They've got numbers, and they can go on strike and refuse to produce food for the rich people. They can refuse to do the farming work that is so essential, which is sort of like going on strike, refusing to work. But sooner or later, they are usually overcome. They're overpowered. Sadly, that's what happened with this peasants' revolt. But it was very, very frightening while it lasted. Very frightening indeed for people in authority and people with power and people with land. Very frightening, because it spread very, very quickly. So it started in the south. It started in Essex and Kent. And then their plan was, of course, to go to London and demand that the poll tax was abandoned. And while they were there, they were going to say they wanted an end to feudalism. They wanted an end to serfdom. Well, this was like saying, we want a complete reorganization of society. We want everything to be different. So that was a massive ask, sort of completely over the top, really. We want a complete change in society. We want freedom. We don't want to be bound anymore. We don't want to be bondmen anymore. So the name Bond comes from, quite a common surname. Somebody who was bound by feudal laws, that they belonged to the village, they belonged to the lord of the manor. They weren't quite slaves, but they weren't free either. They're kind of a halfway house situation. That they were obliged to remain in the village. They were only allowed to leave with a sort of passport from the lord of the manor. If they wanted to trade in the nearby market town, they had to ask permission, and they had to be back before dark. So they were treated like children, sort of adults who lived their whole lives being treated like children, being under somebody else's authority, and having to, say, work 3 days a week for nothing. So it wasn't even a cash economy for many people, which is why local cottage industries developed, to make some money so that they got some money to go and buy clothes and things in the nearby market town. But some people very rarely saw money. They often had to barter. They would take some eggs and they would exchange the eggs for some clothes or fabric to make clothes. Trade, sort of bartering. So this was a sort of culmination of discontent coming from various directions. Discontent with the church, discontent with the way society was organized, discontent because food was costing more, discontent because the war was going badly in France. We couldn't strut around saying we were better than the French. Everything seemed to be going badly, and there were these people with the slogans. Depending which side you're on, it could be called rabble rousing, or it'd be called encouraging people to demand their rights. Depends which side you're on. Rabble rousing, dangerous insurgents, dangerous people, or humble people that have really feel that they're always living under a tyranny, demanding their rights. So simultaneous risings in Essex and Kent, and the question has always been, how did people know what people in other areas were doing? As there was nothing, no media. Well, apparently they had a system. They had a system. They had people sort of, and of course, not many peasants had a horse. In fact, none of them had a horse. Horses were for rich people. But somehow they managed to communicate. They sent messengers. Apparently they did have a very good communication system. That has been researched by a lot of undergraduates doing doing their undergraduate dissertation on this subject, because it's always been puzzling. How did they connect? How did the different areas know what other areas were doing? Well, they seemed to know, and there was a lot of toing and froing and working things out. So first of all, they planned to go to London and approach the government and say, look, well, John of Gaunt, because the king was still young. John of Gaunt was in charge, so they would go and try and negotiate with him. So simultaneous risings in Essex and Kent, and then both sides of the Thames became incandescent with very, very angry peasants, and they opened prisons and let the prisoners out, which was symbolic of their own feeling that they were like prisoners of the system. They would let prisoners out, and also that was something they felt was scriptural, releasing prisoners, giving people freedom. Burning of manor documents. This was always seemed like a good idea, because if you burnt the documents that said you were a bondman, how could you prove later in a court of law that you were a bondman? If the documents had gone walkabout, well, they'd gone walkabout, they'd been burned. So this always seemed like a good idea. But break into the manor house, find the big chest with the 3 locks on it, this big powerful chest full of documents, full of the legal documents saying which people in the village were free men and which men in the village were bondmen, and then details of what they owed, how many days' labour, and what kind of gifts they had to give on the particular holy days. That might be Christmas, Easter, and Whitsuntide. It might be Lady Day. It might be Corpus Christi. All very detailed, possibly different for different villages. If you could burn those documents, we were a country with a very powerful legal system. How could they argue in court that you were a bondman if there was no proof left? So, burning, attacks on tax collectors, MPs, JPs, and anybody with any connection to John of Gaunt. So John of Gaunt's servants became very nervous because they were under attack. So both peasant armies moved towards London, and big encampments developed, and the king and the ministers and the government and all the top people panicked, understandably, because there were, by this time, thousands of peasants. Very, very frightening indeed. And although they weren't armed with ammunition, they hadn't got guns, they had got sticks and clubs and bows and arrows, and they'd made spears. It was a proper army. They weren't unarmed. So all the top government people whizzed off to the Tower of London, where they felt safe and sort of locked themselves in, because the peasants were approaching and it was looking very, very frightening. And for 10 days, the government had been like, didn't know what to do, like frozen, didn't have a policy, didn't know what to do. This was a new development. This hadn't happened before. Lots of very, very angry people surrounding, look, you know, come to London and up to no good. Very, very angry indeed. And the peasants managed to capture, and then news did come that they'd captured Rochester and Canterbury and Chatham. Actually broken into these cities, even though they'd locked their gates. All medieval cities had walls and gates which were locked at night to keep out intruders, and they still managed to get in. So this was very alarming, because London had got many, many gates. London was big. So that's why the government didn't behave in a very noble way. They sort of panicked and rushed off to the Tower of London and to shut themselves away. And then some of the London aldermen decided, this was turned out to be a very bad idea, beware of unforeseen consequences. They decided to take their revenge on John of Gaunt, who was their enemy for various reasons. The victualling or victualling guilds. The London aldermen had quarrelled with John of Gaunt because he'd put the taxes up on bread and cakes and so forth. And so, in a spiteful move, they said, well, we'll show you who's boss. We'll let the peasants into London. And then you'll be sorry for what you did. I mean, it was so ridiculous, like a playground fight. They let down the drawbridge on London Bridge and opened Aldgate, one of the gates in London, to the rebels from Essex. Deliberately let them into the city. And some people blamed the Lord Mayor of London. Everybody's looking around for a scapegoat who's done this ridiculous thing. And the peasant mob had already broken into the Marshalsea and King's Bench prisons. They were now, you could say, out of control, as mobs often are. They get excited, and they also broke into taverns and got drunk, and therefore became even more excitable and violent. And they broke into the Bishop of Winchester's palace and the Bankside, pardon me, the Bankside stews. And Martin's found out what the stews were, which is the stews were the red light district of London, or anywhere. The stews, there was a general word meaning red light district, where you could find the naughty ladies. And interestingly, I mean, this was another example of corruption and how things were going downhill in the church at the time. The most successful, in terms of money, the most commercially successful stews belonged to the Bishop of Winchester. And the ladies of the night were nicknamed Winchester geese, because they literally worked for the Bishop of Winchester. He took the majority of their earnings, which was very embarrassing for the church when this was revealed. I mean, people in London knew about it, but people outside London didn't. But it was a bit late for secrecy, because it then became known that the Bishop of Winchester
Was a madam.
lived like a lord. Well, I mean, the bishops were called princes of the church. They lived in palaces, bishops' palaces. They did live like lords, but he was a particularly rich bishop, and people had never really questioned it. They thought it was sort of income from the fact that Winchester had quite a lot of very good holy relics, and so the pilgrimages produced a steady flow of income. But no, it was because he was running very successful brothels in London. South Bank. And this is where the South Bank got a reputation, Southwark particularly, which lasted for many, many generations. That the South Bank was fun land. It was where later where there were lots of nightclubs and lots of taverns where they didn't seem to bother much about licensing laws and drinking time, and so it had, even and certainly in Shakespeare's time, that the theatres that were built there were seen as very well, dodgy places, really. A lot of people wouldn't go to the theatre in Tudor time. We all think, oh, marvellous, Shakespeare theatres, how wonderful. No, not really. They had a bad reputation because of where they were situated. The South Bank, Southwark particularly, was seen as a lawless area where naughty things happened. North of the river, all very respectable, and government and still a little bit like that. But there's still this slight prejudice if you're a Londoner. There's sort of north of the river and south of the river, and south of the river, anything goes. But particularly, they wrecked the Bishop of Winchester's palace because he was seen as such a hypocrite, a church grandee that was running brothels and benefiting from the income from these brothels. So the mob then moved to John of Gaunt's palace on the banks of the Thames, the Savoy Palace. It's given its name to the Savoy Theatre, and burned it. Then they moved on to the Inns of Court, and they devastated the Inns of Court. They didn't burn them, but they broke in and stole. And then they managed to get into the Tower. The king had been removed because they could see that the mob was getting closer and closer. And they actually captured Simon of Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he was beheaded. And then, I mean, this really was rather horrible. They put his head on a pole and paraded it round as a war trophy. By which time they were losing support because they had become so violent, and it appeared that if they didn't have any leadership, then the leadership didn't seem to be leading very well. The mob seemed to be out of control. The mob of very discontented men seemed to be just doing what they liked. They seemed to have lost their original purpose. And meanwhile, the discontent had spread, and this is where we're not sure how they got their information, but we assume that somebody was telling them what was going on in London. And so the discontent among the peasants had spread alarmingly to other areas: East Anglia, Cambridgeshire, Surrey, Hertfordshire, what we call the home counties. Looting, arson, murders, violent hatred of John of Gaunt, any connection with John of Gaunt. He was hated because he was not the young king. He was exempt because he was young. He was only 15 years old. They hated the poll tax. They hated serfdom. They hated foreigners, and they hated corrupt officials. They were full of rage and hatred of society as it was, that it was so unfair to them. They had all these grievances that were sort of bottled up, and that's why it came out with such, that it ended up being so violent. It would probably have ended the same way even if they hadn't been violent, because of the numbers, terrifying numbers, absolutely terrifying. The numbers of peasants that were roaming around sort of loose in London, and the authorities had locked themselves away and didn't seem to be doing anything very much, was very, very terrifying. And everybody is wondering how the young king was going to sort of behave throughout all this, 15 years old. And even wondering whether he was still safe. Again, it was people lacking knowledge. I mean, we'd be told, wouldn't we, over and over again in newscasts, there'd be people finding out where the king was and reporting on it, or even getting an interview with him saying, I'm absolutely fine, I'm safe, I'm in the Tower. But he wasn't in the Tower anymore, so people weren't quite sure where he was and whether he was safe. So this was a very a sort of moment in time when it could have gone either way. The mob did seem to be in control, but in a very uncontrolled way. They were doing terrible things. They'd murdered an archbishop. They hadn't been, nobody had been arrested for it. They were on the loose. They were free to do what they liked, it appeared. The authorities seemed to have opted out. Very, very frightening, but the mob obviously behaving very badly, appearing to be quite out of control. And how was it going to end? What would the outcome? Were they going to burn all the important buildings in London belonging to all the important people? They'd burned the Savoy Palace. They'd burnt John of Gaunt's London home. He had other homes, of course, including Kenilworth. Kenilworth Castle belonged to John of Gaunt. So it wasn't that he was homeless, but it was a very important statement of how angry these peasants were, that they dared to set fire to the home of the equivalent of the regent, the equivalent of the monarch of the time. They'd set fire to his house deliberately. So things were looking very, very difficult, and nobody quite knew what was going to happen next. But certainly the government authorities seemed to have lost control. Now, there were various other problems, because there were leaders who were making the mob more and more excited with the speeches they were making, and these wonderful, well, not wonderful, these slogans being chanted by the mob. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? It was like a drum beat. It was like, well, we're going to destroy the houses of the rich and the powerful, and we're going then we'll negotiate with them. When they're well and truly frightened, then we will make our demands known, and they will have to give in, because we will have the whip hand. We will have taken over London. That's how it looked. The mob, the peasants, had taken over London, and were acting just as they wanted, setting fire to important buildings, destroying public records, and actually burning down the house of the top person at the time. So if we think about that, and think about, if that happened in Birmingham, how terrified we'd be if we were on the side, if we owned land, if we were the feudal bosses, we'd be frightened, and possibly saying, what's the government up to? Why aren't they negotiating? Why aren't they sort of speaking to the leaders of this peasant revolt, whoever they are? Why isn't the government, why aren't they coming out of hiding and doing something? So eventually, that's what happened. The mayor of London decided to take matters into his own hands and see what he could do. And he then instructed the young king to go and speak personally to the leaders of the peasants' revolt, particularly Wat Tyler, John Ball, Wat, short for Walter. Now, this was very, very brave. Okay, the young king was acting under orders, but he could have said no. He could have said, no, I'm not prepared to do it. They're too violent. They're too volatile. I will be killed. So this was a gamble. It was very, very risky. And the peasants were encamped. They'd stolen food, they'd stolen drink. They were living better than they'd done for years. They'd stolen from shops, and they had camps, and they were settling in. They were settling in. So the king went to where the mayor of London went to Mile End, which is where the peasants, one of the groups of peasants were encamped. Now, the peasants had made various apparently ridiculous demands. First of all, the abolition of serfdom. No more serfs. Every man was to be free, would be paid for his work, and paid to fight in the army, because the other part of the feudal system was every man or boy, if a boy could draw a longbow, then he was regarded as a man. Every man of that was able to serve in the army had to give 40 days to the army and not be paid. After 40 days, they would be paid. 40 days free military service. That was all part of the feudal system. 40 days. And that had always been a problem, because the 40 days might involve the period when they were needed on their farms. Which is why campaigning usually took place at certain times of the year, and medieval wars were not continuous. There were long breaks in medieval wars where everybody went home and dealt with their farms. It was either seed time or harvest or lambing. So that had always been very, very unpopular, that people had to do compulsory military service and they weren't paid. So now they're demanding the abolition of serfdom, which would mean a massive upheaval, really, in the system that had been established for many, many centuries. Abolition of serfdom. Everybody would be free. Rents of 4d an acre, in other words, rents would come down to a reasonable amount. Free markets. Free pardons. That was very, very important, that nobody would be punished for what they'd already done. Not setting fire to important people's homes, murdering people, and so forth. They would be free pardons. That's why they also wanted confiscation of church lands, an abolition of lordship, an abolition of forest laws. I mean, these were really radical. Confiscation of church lands. That wasn't very likely to happen. Abolition of lordship. Now there was that. An abolition of forest laws, which had been introduced by the Norman kings for hunting grounds. That what had once been open land, free of access, had become royal land, and they'd introduced man traps and punishments for anybody trespassing on royal ground. So in other words, royal forest developed instead of it being free and open. The first one, of course, was New Forest, a hunting land for the king. Nobody allowed to go and catch even a little rabbit there. Nobody allowed, if you went there, you were a poacher, and you could be arrested and hanged. And that actually went on. The idea, I mean, for different reasons, the idea that poachers could be killed went on until the 19th century. Usually commuted to transportation, but not always. You could be killed for poaching. So the forest laws were a huge grievance to our ancestors. What had once been open and accessible land was now sealed off and belonged to the king or a great nobleman. That the king had allowed that forest to be, given it as a gift to somebody. No longer accessible to ordinary people. They couldn't even go and pick twigs up. They couldn't even go get firewood because they'd be trespassing. So they wanted abolition of forest laws. But these last three were really kind of over the top and not very likely to be granted. Confiscation of church lands, abolition of lordship, and abolition of forest laws. Too extreme, too radical. So King Richard, accompanied by the Lord Mayor, went to negotiate with the peasant leaders. And they'd already been on a 2-day killing spree. So this was really very, very courageous on behalf of the young king. He must have actually had his heart in his mouth, thinking, I could be assassinated at any moment. Wat Tyler was killed. King Richard showed immense courage. He spoke personally to the peasant leaders and called out to the peasants that were listening that he granted their requests, not the last three, but he said that the serfdom would end, the rents of 4 pence an acre would be allowed, the rent would be reduced, sorry. Free pardons, very important. If they would disperse and go home, behave themselves, leave quietly without causing any trouble, go back to their villages, then there would be no repercussions, there would be no reprisals, they would be forgiven for their rebellion and all the damage and destruction and murder that they'd committed. That was a promise. They went back peacefully and peaceably, they would be forgiven. Free pardon, guaranteed. And so great cheer went up, and the young king was seen as their savior, and it sort of liberated them, and he was just right up there with chocolate. They just thought he was absolutely wonderful because of these words he'd spoken. And of course, he was their anointed king, even though he was only 15. They respected him, they admired his courage, and they believed what he was saying, that he had agreed that they were going to go as long as they went home and behaved themselves on the way home, then no repercussions at all, and that he would grant what they'd asked. He would concede, he would give in. The government would give in to what the peasants required and demanded. So they did agree that they would return to their villages because they felt that they had succeeded, they'd triumphed, they'd achieved their objectives. And they were feeling, many of them, sorry for what they'd done because they weren't drunk anymore. They were beginning to realise that they had got a bit, well, very carried away, and it had resulted in violence, which they hadn't planned. That was a sort of spontaneous thing that had happened because they'd had something to drink and because there were so many of them, that they had got out of control. So yes, they agreed to go home and back to their villages, saying, we've won, it's worked, we've got what we've always wanted, we've got our freedom. The king himself promised it. We have the words, his own words. He spoke to us personally, not through an intermediary, the king himself. So we believe him, we trust him. And tragically, we know what happened. The king and the government had no intention of ending feudalism. No intention at all. Of course not. Why would they abandon a system which gave them such privileges and such advantages? Of course they weren't going to give in, even though there had been such violence. And Wat Tyler had been killed, so they'd lost their leader. And so the government waited until these men, on foot of course, made their way back to their villages, particularly in Essex and Kent, but the ones from the home counties had to make their way back, and waited a few days until they'd all returned, and then they sent out messages to make sure that they'd all gone back to their respective villages and calmed down and were back at work, and then betrayed their promise by sending out troops and investigators and arresting the troublemakers in some villages, everyone that had marched to London. And they were put to death. They were hanged. It was a horrible, horrible betrayal. And the peasants, of course, not being very experienced in the ways of the world, had believed what their young king had told them. They'd completely believed, because they were naive and inexperienced in the ways of the world. They weren't cynical. They weren't stupid, but they weren't cynical. And so it had not occurred to them that this young man who they'd put on a pedestal because he'd spoken to them and they'd admired his courage and that he was their anointed king, it had not occurred to them that he could be lying. So imagine the awful shock that they got when people arrived in the village and started asking very awkward questions, and people were rounded up and punished, hanged. A horrible betrayal. And so life didn't go on quite as it had done before, but the feudal system did continue. But it had been very much undermined by the Black Death, and the government had been extremely shaken by what had happened, by the fact that so many thousands of peasants had shown how discontented they were, abandoned their villages and be willing to march to London. Not a small thing to do when you're on foot. And so it was never done by act of parliament. There was never one moment where they said feudalism is going to be discontinued from this moment on. It wasn't done by act of parliament. It was very, very British. It's sort of very English. It happened as an evolutionary thing. It just happened little by little, very much as a result of the like long-term results of the Black Death. That it was no longer really economically viable to force people to work when it was so much easier to pay them to work. They would work so much better if you paid them, rather than enforcing the old system, which was free farm work for 3 days a week and 40 days military service, no pay. That pay would make a difference. And so gradually, private arrangements were made in individual villages that the peasants would be given their freedom by the lord of the manor. There's no need to go to court or I mean, the lord of the manor was the JP. The lord of the manor was a magistrate. So it was done on a sort of personal level. And unlike some countries, like Russia didn't release its serfs until the 1880s. They still had serfdom in Russia. Quite incredible. The rest of Europe had feudalism. And it's interesting to sort of study which countries were the first to release their serfs and give them full status as free men. The French had done it by revolution, and that's what later gave courage to other countries to do things by revolution. But as I say, it doesn't always work. It very often doesn't, and the peasants get punished, and things are worse than they were before in many cases.
Peasants are revolting.
So yeah, so it only works if you've got, as I've said before, if you've got the middle classes on your side, as they had in the French Revolution, because the middle classes were tired of paying high taxes and had contempt for the royal family. And in the case of Russia, similar situation, contempt for the royal family and the fact that they seem to be under the almost under the power of Rasputin, who was hated by middle class people and the aristocracy. So it's not enough for peasants to get angry and revolt. They usually lose out, and it's worse, often very worse afterwards than it was before. But in our case, it was a horrible shock for the government, and a horrible shock for the peasants as well, that they couldn't trust the king. This attractive young man had let them down so badly. So it was the beginning of this feeling that King Richard, when he finally came to manhood and took over as king in his own right, didn't need Uncle John anymore, that he was a dodgy character, couldn't be trusted. He might have been anointed as king, but he wasn't a good person, which is somewhat unfair because he was under orders. He was 15 years old. He'd been told what to say, and he said it. And then it was up to Uncle John and the government how they responded, and they responded as we would probably have worked out. They didn't mean it when they said they were going to forgive them, and they got a free pardon and they could go back to their villages and nobody would say anything about what they'd done in London. That didn't work at all. So Martin's found two very good appendices, one about John Ball, the radical preacher, and the other one, Appendix 2, about Simon of Sudbury, and a brilliant reconstruction of his face. Modern technology, being able to sort of do this wonderful imaging of a skull and then work out what people look like in real life. Next time I will say more about Wat Tyler. You probably remember doing him at school. You may very well remember doing Wat Tyler and the famous confrontation between Wat Tyler and the king, and then Wat Tyler being assassinated in front of the king. So I'll complete that next time, go into a bit more detail, and we're then going to move on to the actual reign of Richard II when he became king in his own right, and what kind of king he became. But he is one of our kings who failed and came to a very unpleasant end, which you may remember, or maybe your teachers didn't tell you what happened to him because it was so gruesome. So I won't tell you what happened to him.
You'll not spare us, will you?
No. Sort of explain what a horrible end he came to, because it wasn't a successful reign, and marked by disasters and catastrophes and quarrels, arguments. Yes, he definitely gets 2 out of 10. If you're marking him out of 10, he doesn't get very many marks. So thank you very much indeed for listening. And next time we'll fill in a few more details about the Peasants' Revolt, and then look at his reign, trying to be even-handed and fair and reasonable. And then we can sort of perhaps do marks out of 10 when we've completed his reign. We can do a little assessment like they did 1066 and all that.
Thank you, Judy. It's fascinating to sit and watch Judy. It's a bit like lighting a firework. She fizzes off in all directions. It just reveals how much history is buried in her brain. I said before we started this morning, she must have been a nightmare to take on a visit to an abbey or a historic file somewhere. She'd never come out.
I did. My mum was lovely. My mum created my love of history. I think she liked the past, and although she left school on her 13th birthday, my mum was a lifelong learner. She'd have loved the U3A. She would have absolutely loved it. She used to take me to old places when I was quite little, and I just felt something. I felt a sort of vibe, and I don't know whether she did as well, but she certainly took me to stately homes and ruined abbeys, and I think she.
And you had to be prized away.
I did have to be prized away. Yes. Yeah.
Right, gentlefolks. Thank you, Judy.